right. So Harrison just found out that he is going to be living with the daughter of Mrs. Godfrey. And her daughter's husband does what?
Farm.
Not
It
farm.
said farm.
Not farm.
It said
No. He thought it was a farm. He was afraid it was going to be a farm. It was not a farm.
football coach.
He is a football coach and a teacher.
Well, yeah.
Obviously. That's not the most important part. And what does Mrs. Godfrey's daughter do?
Swimming.
She's a lawyer. So it's a lawyer and a teacher.
Wait, Mrs. Godfrey? What? Hold up, what?
Mrs. Godfrey, she is the one that was helping Harrison.
Nate.
That was my sister's teacher's name.
You finally catch that now?
Really?
Well, I knew that, but yeah.
So Mrs. Godfrey was the one that was helping Harrison with the situation.
So is her dad adopting him?
Her mom.
Her daughter, Mrs. Godfrey's daughter, is taking him in to foster
How
him.
old is Mrs. Godfrey?
Old.
Like 60?
I would say probably in her 50s.
He's Godfrey.
I thought she was like really young, like a 20-year-old.
No, she's like in her 50s, so her daughter's probably like
30 something.
20, 30. Yeah. Chapter 8. Ron Kelly picked Harrison up at the bus station. He had farmer's hands, rough and strong, but from working with weights and wood, not cows and tractors. His grip could crush stones, but his smile warmed Harrison's heart because it had just as much warmth as the smile he had grown used to seeing on Mrs. Godfrey's face. He also didn't mind when Mr. Kelly asked Harrison to call him coach because that's what he said all the students called him, whether they played football or not. Mrs. Godfrey's daughter was waiting for them at home, a big gray house with white shutters and a bright red front door. Coach's wife had long red hair. She wore thin glasses, but they couldn't hide her pretty green eyes, and a resemblance to Mrs. Godfrey was obvious when she smiled. Mrs. Kelly was a lawyer, and Harrison could see why. Words flowed from her mouth like a song. Coach spoke more like a barking dog, and Harrison wondered how it was that the two of them could get along so well, but they seemed to. They showed Harrison his room, and it was nice. While he studied it, Harrison caught Mrs. Kelly looking at his eye. He wanted to cover it because a thing so ugly didn't seem to fit in such a room. There were curtains on the windows. The bed sheets were crisp and white with the clothes in the closet were clean and ironed without tears or stains. Beside the dresser stood a case of shelves bursting with books. Harrison forgot about his eye at the sight of the books. Mrs. Kelly used a long finger to break one loose, and she held it up for him so that she could see a serious young man's face on the cover, a sword in his belt, and his hand gripping a ship's rope as he looked out over the waves. On the distant shore, a rainbow rose from the land, arching across the sky and promising good things to come. "Have you ever read Louis L'Amour?" Mrs. Kelly asked. Harrison shook his head, not wanting to tell her he'd never read a book, period. "I think you'll like this." She handed him the book. "My brother loved the Sacketts. It's a family that comes to America when it was a new land." "I was a Hardy Boys guy," said Coach with a grunt from the hallway. Harrison shifted his feet. He hadn't heard of them either. "Are you hungry?" Mrs. Kelly asked. Harrison nodded. He followed them downstairs. They all sat at the table where Mrs. Kelly had lunch already laid out, sandwich meat, cheese, bread, and salad. Harrison watched, mystified, as they bowed their heads and Coach uttered a prayer. Harrison's first two families said lots of prayers, but it had been many years since he'd heard them, and the prayers hadn't done anything to make them nicer people. His face felt hot when Coach looked up and saw him gawking. Coach just smiled and passed the bread. Harrison put together a turkey sandwich and doused it with ketchup. "We hope you feel welcome, Harrison," Mrs. Kelly said, "and that you like your room." "I do." "You're a big kid," Coach said. "My mother-in-law said you might want to play some football." Mrs. Kelly rattled her butter knife against the plate. "Really, Ron? Football? Harrison hasn't been sitting for more than 5 minutes and you're already going there." Coach shrugged and scowled at his wife, but not in a mean way. "He's a big boy, and you know I need all the help I can get. Have you ever played before, Harrison?" "No, but I like to watch it, and I think I could." Jennifer flashed Coach a look, sharp as a knife. Would you like some salad, Harrison? Is it okay if I don't? He asked. The green food looking like something he'd give to the cows. Of course. And I would like to play football, Coach. Coach grinned and slapped a hand on the table, jarring the silverware. Then it's settled. Tomorrow after school, I'll get you geared up and you can get started. No sense wasting time. You'll need 10 practices before you can play in a game, but that means you can play in next week's game. This is great. You'll like the team. Mrs. Kelly gave her husband an impatient look. Coach has a lot riding on this season, Harrison, so you'll have to forgive his overexcitement. There's no such thing as overexcitement when you're talking about football, said Coach. Mrs. Kelly continued as her husband wasn't there. The varsity coach is retiring after this season, and there are some people who'd like Coach to take over. Not everyone. Coach clenched and unclenched his jaw so that the muscles in his face did a dance. Not the head of the booster club, Mrs. Kelly said in a voice as light as the butter she spread across her bread. He thinks we should find someone outside the program. I need to win the league, Coach said. Then he can't say no. But we lost the first 2 games, Mrs. Kelly said. We should win this week, Coach said. I haven't lost to East Manfield in 10 years. You've never started out 0-2 and made the playoffs. Mrs. Kelly bit into her slice of bread and sipped at a cup of tea. A dab of butter clung to her upper lip until she wiped it away with a napkin. But winners never quit and quitters never win. How fast are you? Coach asked. Harrison blushed and shrugged. He didn't know how to answer. As a little kid, he won all the races on the playground, and he was always good in gym class, but he'd never been allowed to play any sports. Pretty fast, I think. He'll need a physical, Mrs. Kelly said. Coach scratched the stubble on his head. Maybe I can get Doc Smart to see him and get us a clean bill of health. Mrs. Kelly pointed quickly to her own eye and said, What about... Your mom said his eye is fine. It just looks bad, Coach said. Harrison knew from the mirror that what should be white in his eye was still blood red, and that even though the swelling had been gone for several weeks now, the skin around his eye was still marbled with purple and a sickly yellow. It's Sunday, Ron. Coach waved a hand. Doc won't mind. He's a friend. If Harrison wants to play, there's no sense in making him wait. Mrs. Kelly sighed. I guess you can ask. Coach drove an old white pickup truck. Rust crept along the underside of the doors, and the tires looked dusty and smooth. Riding through town, Harrison couldn't help admiring the neatly trimmed lawns and the old houses wearing coats of fresh paint. Doc Smart lived in his big house up the long driveway. A handful of kids played frisbee on the lawn. They wore fancy clothes, shirts with collars, dresses, and shoes that reflected the sunlight. A pretty girl with a blonde ponytail caught the frisbee and stopped the game to watch Harrison follow Coach up the front steps and into the house. Harrison put a hand up to cover his discolored eye. Doc Smart showed them into the office where he poked and prodded Harrison. Let me take a look at that eye. The doctor shone a penlight at it. May I ask what happened? Hit by a belt buckle, Harrison said. Coach cleared his throat. Feels fine, though, Harrison said. He didn't want to wreck the whole deal before he even got started. Doc Smart glanced at Coach and snapped off his light. Well, it's healed up nicely. Shouldn't keep you from playing football. Doc took Harrison's blood pressure and banged his knee with a rubber hammer, then signed some papers and told Coach that Harrison was ready for action. Doc followed them out onto the front porch and called to the ponytail girl. Becky, I want you to meet Harrison. Harrison, this is my daughter, Becky. She's in your grade. Becky held out her hand and Harrison shook it, surprised by her solid grip, even though his hand swallowed hers whole. He also liked the way she didn't stare at his red eye. It was as if she didn't notice, even though he knew she must have. Harrison is Coach Kelly's... Harrison's joining the family. Coach put his hand on Harrison's shoulder and gave it a squeeze. Harrison felt his face burn. Becky looked at him in confusion. Coach steered Harrison down the steps toward the truck. Harrison saw the other kids in the lawn watching him like a zoo animal. He climbed into the truck beside Coach. As they backed down the driveway, Becky stepped down off the porch. She saw Harrison's eye and then did something that he'd never forget. With all the other kids watching, Becky waved to Harrison and spoke in a voice that all the kids could hear. I'll see you in school, Harrison. Her smile filled Harrison's heart with sunshine and honey, and his own hand popped up on its own to wave back at her. That's a pretty little girl. Coach nodded his head toward the doctor's daughter. Harrison looked down at his feet and scuffed a gum wrapper across the floor mat. Don't you think? Coach backed the truck up into the street. I don't know. Harrison studied the wrapper. His ears burned at the sound of Coach's soft laughter. Coach settled down and asked Harrison if he wanted to go fishing. Harrison said he had never been, but he'd be happy to try it. They returned back home to get their gear, and while Mrs. Kelly packed a basket with sandwiches and lemonade, Harrison studied some framed photographs on the table in the living room. In one, Mrs. Kelly wore a wedding dress, and Coach had it on a tuxedo. In another, Mrs. Kelly hugged Coach on the sidelines of a football field, and Coach held up a trophy. Another caught Harrison's eye, and he picked it up. It was Coach, but he wore an army uniform. In one hand, he held a gun, but in his other arm, he'd slung around a second soldier. They smiled like brothers at a reunion. The other soldier had a small beard that was as black as his eye, reminding Harrison of a movie poster he'd once seen for a story about the devil. When Mrs. Kelly appeared behind him, Harrison returned the picture to its place. Coach was in the war, he asked. Mrs. Kelly handed Harrison the picnic basket. The Gulf War. It was the first war in Iraq, a lot of years ago. That's his friend? Very good friend, she said, looking sadly at the picture. Major Bauer. Did he die? Harrison kept his voice low. Mrs. Kelly seemed to think about it. No, he was hurt very badly, but he's far from dead. You'll meet him sometime. Harrison could tell there was something special about the Major that Mrs. Kelly wasn't telling him. But they both heard Coach calling from the garage, so she put her hand on Harrison's back and steered him toward the door. Coach laid 2 poles on the back of the truck, dusted his hands, and they set out for the lake. Coach had a boat with an outboard motor pulled up along some grass and trees on the rocky shore. When Coach asked Harrison to help him drag the boat into the water, Harrison grabbed hold of the handle in front and hauled it across the rock beach and into the water before Coach could put down his basket and fishing gear. Coach stared at him, and Harrison wondered if he'd done something wrong. With the motor, that boat weighs about 400 pounds, Coach said. Harrison looked at the boat and shrugged. Okay, great. Let's load it up. Coach set the gear and basket into the bottom of the boat. Harrison got in, and Coach launched them into the deeper water and hopped aboard. The engine sputtered, then hummed. Coach steered for a point of rocks a ways away and dropped anchor at a spot where Harrison could see the stony bottom. Coach handed Harrison a fishing rod before focusing on his own ring, fussing with the reel, breaking open a big plastic box, and tying a small metal fish lure dangling hooks onto the end of the line. Coach looked up and blinked at Harrison, nudging the box his way before he looked back again. Coach looked up again. Before he looked back down, Coach looked up again. I'm sorry, you said you never went fishing. Here I am giving you the tackle box. It's just second nature to me, that's all. You never even saw anyone fishing? Just along the bridge at the Sawmill River on TV, I guess. Okay, sure. Here, let me tie one of these babies off for you. Coach took the pole Harrison held and expertly tied a curved golden fish onto the end of the line. The lure sparkled in the sunlight. You just cast it towards these rocks and reel it in like this. So why was the coach staring at Harrison at the dock with a look of surprise? He was really strong. He was lifting something that was 400 pounds, like it was nothing. Right? Is that a good trait for a football player to have?
Yeah, it feels like Sawyer.
Yeah. I don't know who that is, but